How's it going? Woo! No, really, how's it going? Is it actually going well, or are we just sort of like, whatever? A little bit of both. Can everybody see since you're staring at the sun all day? Honestly, I'm seeing spots. I just thought I'd man up and just take a look. And it was only like 2 or 3 minutes, so it was fine. I'm sure I'll be all right. So, as everyone has already multiply introduced me, I won't go too deep into who I am, but my name is Kelly J. Andrews. It's my Twitter handle if you want to find me there. I spend pretty much all day on Twitter, so don't judge. But I am a developer advocate at CodeShip. So what I like to do is I like to go around to different meetup groups and talk about CI/CD best practices, which some of you have actually heard because I come to Atlanta now. This is my third time. She's by far the most in one city that I've been to. But essentially, we like to talk about best practices because not everybody has them or knows them readily, and we want to make sure that everybody knows that CI/CD and automation and builds are really awesome. I also help people get up and running with CodeShip, so if you have any questions about CodeShip directly, definitely come see me. Happy to chat and tell you, I don't know if I don't know, or tell you what the answer is. Sometimes it's both. So, all right. So let's talk about. We talked a little bit about actually just building a React app. How many are currently working in React directly now? Awesome. So this won't be completely new information, but I want to talk about some general patterns for React, and some of these are used often. Some of them are less often. Some of them you may have heard about and maybe have never tried, which is also okay. Some of them I haven't tried. You sort of fall into, the reason why they're called patterns is you sort of fall into this, repeated state of code where you see the same thing come up over and over. And a few of these are definitely ones that you should know about, and if you don't, then I'm helping you out. If you already do, it's good to review them and kind of remember why you're using them. But other than that, we'll kind of go through some general syntax, which is just a couple. We'll talk about presentational components and logic components. So I broke them down into two because typically what you want to do is separate concerns in React to where you have more of a presentational component that just presents data, and then you have a logic component which will handle all of the logic of the application itself, which is always easier said than done because I just like to cram everything into one component, call it a day. But they're best practices anyways, right? Okay, so let's talk about JSX spread attributes. This is one you'll see a lot. This is JSX specific, so if you're looking for it on like a JavaScript website, it kind of looks like something else you'll see, but it's not exactly. But what it lets us do is pass object properties as component attributes. So what you'll see in the first function here with greeting, you see us passing first name and last name as absolute specific props there, so you know that it's always going to be first name, it's always going to be last name. There is a different way that you can do this to where you can pass in an object and then you can use the triple dot to do a spread attribute through JSX, and it will pass first name and last name directly into the greeting component without you having to rewrite them. So if you're getting data in from somewhere else, you can just kind of pass them through as properties that way, which lets you then sort of streamline your code and not have to rewrite the same things several times. What you might recognize this as, though, is something similar to destructuring, which is a very elegant way to kind of bring props into functional, stateless components, which I'll talk to in a second. But if we look at like the first example, it's bringing in props as a whole, which means that in our return statement, we're going to have a props.name. So we can iterate through and use the dot syntax to find all the attributes that we're bringing in just as props. So it comes in as an object. You can also then bring in individual props by using the curly braces around that. And what that will do is it will take whatever that input is and look for the dot name in this case. So instead of passing props as a parameter into this component, we can actually just use the name, which cleans it up a little bit. So you notice, I mean, it's not a ton, but if you have a lot of different properties throughout a component, writing props all the time gets a little repetitive. There are other ways around it, but this is a really clean way, especially when you're using a stateless function, which I'll again talk about next. The other side of this, though, is if you have additional props that you want to pass, say a class name, you can also pass those in using the triple dot, and that will then not only specify the name from properties, but it will then pass in the rest of them. So it's a standard ES6 feature, I guess you can call it. So it's a standard ES6 feature so that props will then become its own object afterwards. So name gets popped out, props gets passed in as its own separate object, and then you can iterate through those. In this case, it's really streamlined if you're passing in like kind of the div level component parameters. So if you want to have like I said, class name, or if you have, like any, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I'm sure there are some out there. These will automatically get passed through, and then you can pass them directly into that div. So it streamlines the code a bit. And if they're not there, then it's just an empty object and nothing gets added. So it cleans it up quite a bit, as opposed to having to add a whole bunch of things there through the props object directly. Okay, so those are the kind of the basic ones. Let's talk a little more about presentational components. Okay, so as I've already mentioned a couple times now, stateless functional components. These are kind of my favorite thing that's going in React. And it's been out for a little while now. But if you haven't used them, definitely take a second look because they are super fun to write and they make your code a lot easier to use and update later. Generally, people say they're more performant. I haven't really seen like proof one way or another. The biggest performance you're going to get is writing them because they're a little simpler to write. There is a way that you can call stateless functional components as functions as opposed to using react.createElement, which I'll show you in the code sample. They're a little bit lighter weight in the fact that they aren't extending the React component class. You bring in props, UI comes out, so it's very streamlined in that regard where you don't have a whole bunch of things going on. You don't need any. Typically, you want to write these if you don't have any sort of lifecycle functions that are necessary. So that's one way to kind of know that it's a good candidate for a stateless function. There's really no state at all. These typically just output a presentational layer. They can also have some functions built into them that you can help with other things and actually do callbacks and that kind of thing. They are great for just rendering out style. They should typically make up a large portion of your application. So most of the applications we write have a lot of HTML. The HTML can easily get wrapped up into a functional component, and then you have a logical component that will render those out and pass the properties to them. You can also add prop types and default props, so they still function a lot similar in a lot of ways to other components, but they're a little easier to look at. So let's take a look at so the example we had earlier with greeting. So this is a perfect example. It takes no properties. It literally just renders out div hi there. Not exactly the most complex component you'll ever write, but it's kind of gets the idea across of a stateless function. What I don't want to have here is I don't want to extend a React component just to print out a div and some text. So this can be written as a function. If I want to pass in props, I can, similar to the previous examples, I can actually pass in properties and I can do props.name and render that out directly. And then if I have name and I need it required, I can also use the prop types. Prop types here, so I have it as a string and it's required, and I can default it to guest if I want a default value there as well. You can also, it is good to know that if you pass in like a JSX, like a destructured type, so if I have the curly brackets and name, I can actually set a default value there too. I can have name equal default or guest in this case. So either way will work. They also do allow for context types, although if you read the React info on context, they're kind of not really, don't really necessarily want you to use it, but it's there if you need it, so just thought I'd throw it in. But context does get passed to these as well. And then at the bottom, what you'll see here is I'm passing greeting as opposed to the standard like greater than, less than, brackets. I'm using, I'm calling it strictly as a function, so you can actually, although that's actually wrong, I would call this literally as a function and pass in the parameters, as opposed to putting it through the React create element, which is what the normal component syntax looks like. So that's where you get a performance boost. It kind of goes through this, it goes through less hops to get to what it needs to get to. And it just calls it strictly as a function. Let me, glad you asked. So if I have, yeah, so it actually looks like I can pass in like this. So this is my header function. Let me scale it up a little bit. This is my header function, and I'm passing in my properties just like this. Yes. Yeah, I believe so, yeah. Yeah, I don't actually do it that way, but yeah, I'm pretty sure you just pass in the object literal, and then it'll, so if you have like, you know, if you don't do model, and pass in this dot props dot model, I believe it would be like that. And then that would come in as the props, and then if you destructure on the other side, which I believe I'm doing, yeah, it would pull in like that. I'm in the process of refactoring my to-do app because I just sort of took the one that was out there and made it work, and now I want to go back and actually make it clean, which is harder, easier said than done. So, but this is sort of in the middle of it. But yeah, this is the header here, and the header file is just a functionless component that takes model and then does some stuff, and it's a lot cleaner than what it was, where all of the, I won't get too into it, but I cleaned up a lot of things here already, and it's just sort of in the middle of it. But I won't get too far into it. But that's sort of what those look like when you call them as a function. So sorry I didn't update that, but that should be an actual like function call. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, now you can also use, and there's kind of debate on whether or not this is really a pattern, but you can use these as a proxy as well. So typically, if you have on your application a button where type equals button, just make it a stateless functional component and call the same thing over and over, right? That way, I mean, it's going to save you typing type equals button every time, which, you know, can reduce human error at that point. And then you can always pass in, you know, class names if you need that, and it shows kind of the rendering below it. But that can greatly streamline a lot of things. I do this with buttons. I've done it with like SVG. So like icons even, we'll pass in like an icon and just put type, and it calls a specific SVG file or something like that. There's all kinds of different places you can use these to where it will essentially make your components a lot easier to work with, and when you update the application in the future, there's a lot less there that you have to go back and, I mean, if you change it from type equals button to remove it, or, you know, change it in some way, you have to go back and change it where every place it's at, as opposed to this where it's kind of a, you know, which is the benefit of componentized building anyways. Okay, so style components. Style components are essentially ways that you can do You can isolate styles from the rest of the app functionality. It's similar to the stateless function in a lot of ways, but you can just kind of isolate those styles into those individual components. So this way, like if we look at the button again, where button, say we have a primary version of a button, and we have our original button where it was giving us type, but we also want to pass in specific class names. And then if we want to use primary, we can also add to that button-primary class as well. If you're not familiar with class names function there, that's a library that's really useful in React that lets you create your class names with just kind of basically it pass the items into a function. If it's true, false, it will. If it's true, obviously it'll render out that specific one or return a specific thing. So there's a lot of good ways to kind of go about doing that. And it sort of puts them all together into one string and returns them as opposed to manually having to concatenate things, that sort of stuff. So in this case, we can now create another stateless function called primary button, to where if anybody adds primary button in the application, it will automatically write button with the primary attribute passed through. That way, it's always going to be the same. Then, if you need to change that class somewhere down the road, obviously you just go here, change it from button-primary to button-alert or something like that, and then they'll all change. Mm-hmm. So whenever you pass in, like on the bottom here, I just say primary, and what that passes in is true. So if you have something like in HTML, checked is typically, if you pass in checked, it's true, so it's checked. So this same thing here, if I pass in primary to the component, primary is true. So then the logic above says if primary is true, and then the double ampersand there just returns, in this case it ends up returning button primary. So if that's true, then it returns the second value. Cool. I also found, as I was kind of doing some research, it's called Styled Components Library, which I thought was really interesting. I'm not necessarily sold on it, but if you're into figuring out how to streamline your styled components, styled-components.com, it's actually a really cool. I'm gonna go there. I'm gonna do it. Hang on one second. I gotta figure out how to get out of my. Hang on. Exit full screen. There it is. I've got the new touch bar, and I still don't know what anything does. So like you'll see here, it has this these two buttons. So like styled A is this, each one of these. If you have a props.primary, then it's the background's white. If I go in here and change that to black, it just kind of, see how it sort of re-renders thing. If I want to change the border radius, I can do that. So if I make it like really big, it's really more obvious. I can make the width to like 15, make the margins like 8. So there's all kinds of cool stuff you can do, and essentially it's just taking all those styles and packing them into a specific component. I thought it was cool, kind of a cool demo. I haven't really played with it in the wild yet, because every week there's something new to play with and I can't do them all. But that one I thought was kind of neat, so I wanted to pass it on. Okay, so let's talk. I'm trying to build up here as we go, and more, from real simple to more complex. So let's talk about layout components. Layout components should essentially build the structure of your application. So if you have like a left, sidebar and a main, those two things can go in there, and you can pass components into them. There probably shouldn't be any state. It's mostly just presentation, and it rarely, if ever, will change, because you don't typically change the left and like a sidebar and a main, which at that point then makes them highly optimizable. So if we look at this one, like a left side, right side, and pass in a component to each. And then what that lets me do is essentially just pass that into a stateless component like horizontal split here, pass in left side and right side as my props. I can add them to a flex container. There's nothing going on here outside of strictly just layout. I want to be able to set essentially my containers, my wrappers, put things into them, pass them through, and they're good to go. All right, conditional rendering. This is one of my favorites because I really like ternary operators. So when you have layout components, this pairs really well with those. You can have, based on certain things that come in, you can flip between two different components using just a quick ternary operator. If you don't know how to use a ternary operator, go out and learn it. It's super simple. It's just the question mark with a true result and a colon and then the false result. Really excellent for like single condition changes like logins or admin, showing or hiding errors, that kind of thing. A couple of ways to write them. So if you have a condition and you use the double ampersand, that will be whenever it's true, it's going to render out what's on the right side. So this is one thing that like I always didn't quite get. If there is that essentially just leaving the double ampersand not in like an if statement, like you're not evaluating both sides, you're essentially evaluating the one and then it renders out the second part of it automatically. And then if you use the double pipe for or, if it's false, it'll render out the second part of it. So it's kind of fun. But definitely get to know those. Those pop up every once in a while and they're really useful as opposed to like rendering out null as a second option. You can just render out one or the other. So then if you do the condition, and the condition is typically, it's in parentheses, and then you have a question mark. So when it's true, it's going to do the one immediately after it, and then you have a colon. It's kind of broken up into two lines, and when you do this in React, you see that a lot. And it's mostly just so you can separate out the difference between a true, when it's rendering for true and when it's rendering for false. So if your condition is logged in and logged in is false, you would see a login button. If it's true, maybe you see like an avatar or something like that. You can also then, using the parentheses, you can then render out larger items. Like in this case, it's just sort of multi-line, but you can do pretty much whatever you want, and you can also just pass in other components there as well. So if you have a login button, that's a component, pass that one in. If you need an avatar or a section for a user, you can pass that in instead. So it pairs really well again with kind of layout. It lets you sort of drop things in and control that flow a little bit like that. So. All right, children pass-throughs. Use this when like children are unknown. So I've used these in the past with like a kind of a modal or a dialog window. I don't necessarily know what's going to be there. I just know that I want to have that and then be able to pass things into it, which is why I say it's perfect for like a column, dialog, boxes, that kind of thing. You can specialize specific components. So if you need a wrapper with some styling that's very specific, you can always pop that around another component and it'll pass that in. And then I like it because you're allowed to nest your components super easy this way. You can just sort of drop in whatever you need. You don't always know what you're going to pass in, so you're rendering out those sort of each thing that's just contained within it. And then you can pass in standardized props with clone element, which I'll show you as well. So like in this one, we have a fancy border where you can pass in a color through the props, and then it just renders out everything that's with children. So children is kind of a specific way that React passes things down, and it can be an H1 tag, it can be another component, it can be spans, it can be divs, it can be whatever you need it to be. So let's see. Okay, so then the second part here is when I when I have specific things that I want to pass down and sort of manipulate the child, I can actually do that, where in my render function I have children with props, and I'm doing a map, essentially looping through each child, and then passing that function into each child element. So if I want to add some sort of like click handler, I can do it easily this way with a child pass through. So my parent is essentially going to get called, and then everything underneath it that is a child element would get some sort of function if that's what I needed it to do. There's a few different things you can do with that, some tricks you can do to make sure it's a component versus just a standard HTML element, but there's some really cool stuff you can do there. I built an entire like form doing this same kind of thing to where each thing would pass back the properties. It was kind of hacky and a couple years ago, so I'm not ashamed of it. But yeah, you can do all kinds of cool stuff this way. And then you just render out the children with props in the render function there, so return that. Okay, so that kind of gets us to as complex as I want to get on the presentational components. So let's talk a little bit more about logic. Okay, so in that last one with the map through the children, that allowed me to essentially render out each item, and that's basically passing in arrays as children. So it lets me do repeated items. I'm going to use a map function and return something. It works really well with those JSX spread attributes we talked about in the beginning, because I can pass in props, kind of at will. And you really do this often. I mean, every time you have a list item, if you have multiple things that all sort of render out the same thing, they're all going to come out they're going to be rendered by an array and then as children. So in this example, I have like a UL that's just taking first and second as an array and doing a dot map for each item. I'm doing an LI with item in it. So I'd have LI item, LI first, and then LI second. So 2 list items there. If you're doing something with more messages, you can pass in, like I was saying earlier with the JSX spread attribute, you can do the triple dots message, and then it'll pass those directly into the message component. So you do this very frequent because there's a lot of repetition, and that's the way to use the components, is sort of pass those in and do a mapping of each one. Okay, so container components. These are somewhat like presentational, but those layout components, but they're slightly different in the fact that you're going to probably connect data sources to the presentation layer in this way. It's going to help you manage the state of components, and then you can have some conditional rendering that will work off of those states, and then you can have different containers and contexts using the same components. So if you have one wrapper with all the same components, it's going to look different than like another container component would with those same components within it. So something like this with a comment list, I'm going to pass in essentially I'm going to get a state for comments created, and then I'm going to do like an AJAX call here, or fetch or something else that's more ES6-like. But essentially, I'm going to go out, I'm going to grab some JSON data, pull that in, and set my state, which is then going to re-render my comment list. So my comment list is going to be probably a stateless function, right? It's going to be all HTML, but when this component updates, I'm going to get a new list of comments, and those comments go directly into my comment list and render out that way. So the question you had earlier about like how do I pass things into, if I'm doing like an HTTP call and getting data in that way, component did mount is kind of a good spot to do that. So you're going to do component did mount when it adds, and essentially it's the component mounts, and then it runs that function once, and then it'll run this dot set state and add the result to it. So one way to do that too is if you have, so this would actually render kind of funky, because if comments doesn't, you most likely have a comments map on the other side of this. So if that doesn't exist, it'll probably blow up because there's nothing there. So you would have, if, you'd have a comment as a condition, and if comments, which I may actually have here, but if the comments are null, essentially if they're empty, then render loading, right? Some sort of loading graphic, else render this, so that way it's not blank and it doesn't blow up on you. Okay, so state hoisting. We're starting to get into some crazy stuff now. It's getting a little different. So this is going to keep your parents and siblings in sync. So oftentimes you'll have sort of a wrapper component with a bunch of components in between, and you want to be able to pass things back and forth, which sounds against the React mantra, but when you're doing larger components, you want to have sort of these isolated states that aren't necessarily app level, but they're sort of smaller in one set of components. You want to have that parent be like that one source of truth. And I kind of already got to this, but it reduces the entire application state. If I don't need something in, say, like a form to be in the application state itself, I can just keep that into the form element, the form component directly. So you see that often with like controlled inputs. So in this example, we have an onChange function that gets passed to an input, which then passes back. It just basically, whenever this input changes, it's going to run that function. So in the container, what you'll see is new name arrow this dot set state name colon new name, right? So that's the onChange function that gets passed to the name. So then essentially what will happen is every time that input changes, it's going to set the state to that container component. With the controlled name input, this was essentially the same thing. I wrote this a couple weeks ago, and now I'm trying to remember what controlled name input exchange. Yeah, same thing. Okay, that's just the controlled input with where the input itself is isolated, as opposed to passing it back to a parent. You'll see the input just pass it to itself. And then you can call that component and it'll maintain that state isolated in between it. That gets a little tricky because then you got to be able to get it out. So you're going to end up passing some sort of callback function down the line just so the parent can get it. But essentially you see this come up most often with like inputs in this way because you have to be able to get the content out of it, and it also has to maintain its own value, because if you've ever tried just typing in value equals and then trying to edit it, right, nothing changes, so you have to control them. And this is just two different ways to do it. One is it re-renders the name, which is the input. That's what's going on. So the first one is the container passes the new property down to the stateless function, and then that stateless function just passes the value back up, which then re-renders the stateless function. Second one is the input self-contained and holding its own state. Now I remember. Okay, so in the case of like a text box, same kind of thing, right? The onChange is going to then set the state to where the name is going to equal the target value, which in this case is that particular input. So it keeps that local text box state together, and then allows you to sort of keep it updated, and the value re-renders itself, that kind of thing. Okay, render callbacks. This one is similar to child pass-through. The child is now a function, and it's treated that way. So embedding stateless functional components, essentially you're embedding a stateless functional component in the render function itself, which you'll see in the code example here. So typically it's combined with like conditional rendering as well. But you'll see like here is a width component that takes in some children, and the children is ran as a function, and it's passed in 500. So when it's output, so when you want to write this, you write the component width, and then you pass in where the width is, say that you're just passing in like whatever the window width is, and in this case it was 500. So it would render out window is 500 because it's running that function in the middle of this component. Follow me yet? This one's tricky. They get a little trickier. Okay, so let's see if I can explain it a little better. So my stateless function is width, and it's taking in a property children, and then it's essentially running children as a function later. And then when I do run the component, that function is what becomes then children. So the function in the brackets in the middle is what is passed into the properties and then ran through with the 500. So the parameter coming into that function, child function, is width, and then it's rendered out that way. So to get a little more, maybe a little more real world with it, if we want to do like a window width, right, our set state would have an event listener for resize. So if the window gets resized, then I would set the state's width to target.innerWidth, and that would then take the children, the props.children, and render out this.state.width. So it's the same kind of thing as before, but now what I'm doing is I'm actually passing in the state to the child function. So instead of just rendering out 500 in that case, it would render out whatever the inner width of the current window size is. A little hairy, a little fun. I don't use these terribly often, mostly because I haven't really found a great reason to. This is probably the best reason I've seen, is to do like something with that. Then you can use the function that's passed into that component and do something with it specific based on the width or height or overall size or whatever you need. Okay, so the last one I want to talk about is higher order components, which is quite possibly the most confusing React component pattern out there. And to those of you, anybody actually using higher order components? Cool. Then everything I say from this point on is going to sound true, and whether I'm wrong or not. Okay, so most of these last couple are so you can like connect some sort of data source to your component, and that's essentially what higher order components are going to allow you to do. If you have like repetitive components or containers, and you want to always add sort of the same event listeners or change listeners, that kind of thing to it, always passing the same data, same model. It allows you to do that, and essentially it allows you to hijack the render and change it up a little bit. They are written as functions, and those functions return a class. And you'll see this a lot with Redux. So Redux has a function called connect, and essentially you'll connect it to the data store. It does reduce some boilerplate code, and that's sort of the main part of the to-do app refactor. I'll show you where I've gotten with that in a second as well. But it looks sort of like this. So it's a function. In this particular instance, it's connect, and it takes composed component as a parameter, and it returns a class that extends react.component. And essentially what it's going to do is it's going to let you run through it's going to essentially add, so you'll see these come up as decorators now too, because as people add like new, like the latest and greatest Babel libraries, you can use these as just decorators, and then you'll do like @connect above a specific class, and it essentially wraps that whole component inside this one. So what it's doing here in this case is when component did mount, it's doing this.setState, name is Michael, and then in the render function, it's returning the whole component. It's adding whatever this.props that got passed in, and then name equals this.state.name, right? So that's a pretty contrived example. So what I'm doing with my to-dos, so I have a model that I use for like create, update, and delete. And in the original one, I was sort of just passing that model around as a parameter, as an attribute to each component. which I don't really like. I want to be able to sort of connect it to that model and then let that model kind of do what it needs to do and not have to be concerned about which one gets it. If I need it on a specific one, I wrap it in the model and it has access to all the functions I need. So in this particular one, I am literally just saying this.setState model is model, and then I'm returning my compose component where the model is this.state.model. When I want to use this, it is just as easy as calling it as a function. So my to-do app now has model as a property, whereas before I was passing it in. So now I can go in here and it's this.props.model, but I'm not actually, there's a whole lot of code. I hate showing this, but it's like the only good example I really have right now. So like my to-dos is this.props.model.todos, which then kind of gets created as the model comes in. But I don't have to go through each individual component. So there's another one like, so in the header I also have the model, which I'm actually passing this one down in this case, so it kind of defeats my purpose. But I didn't really need it more than just the function create. So I could actually just pass in model.create here and really streamline what gets passed around. But as I start to build this out, I will have like to do the list, and the list will become also become model enabled because it's going to have all the different to-do items come into it. It's going to pass through. As they update, it kind of needs to have all those pieces there, and I can pass the functions around from the model directly. So they get a little tricky, but once you start, once you have it, you'll realize you have a really good use case if you're doing the same sort of prop type connections all the time, and then you can probably move that into a higher order component that will allow you to do that manipulation and add those directly without you having to redo it every single time. So that's kind of the long and the short of them. I highly recommend go out and read it, educate yourself on them. They're really useful. You're going to be a little confused at first, but that's okay. You'll get through it. So, okay. So just to wrap up, we talked briefly about some general syntax patterns with like JSX spread attributes, destructuring, that kind of thing. Walk through some different presentational components for you, and then talked about the logic components. Definitely when you're building out React apps, make sure you try to split out as best you can. That way, if you're updating just styles, the whole app logic doesn't have to get updated as well. It's just a good pattern and habit to get into. And that is it. So.